50 years ago, someone made a decision that completely changed modern knitting. And it wasn't inventing a new stitch or designing a famous sweater, and it wasn't even teaching people how to knit. Instead, he changed something much more important. He changed the way knitters thought. His name is Kaffe Fassett, and if you've not heard about him before, don't worry, because by the end of this video, I think you're starting to notice his influence almost everywhere in modern knitting. But to understand why, we have to go way back to a train journey in Scotland. Part 1. A painter, not a knitter. Here's something that surprised me. Kaffe Fassett never intended to become one of the most influential names in modern knitting. In fact, he didn't even plan to become a textile artist. He wanted to be a painter. Kaffe Fassett didn't grow up in an ordinary home. His parents ran the famous Nepenthe restaurant in Big Sur, California, where musicians, artists, and other famous people gathered. And although it was a very remote place, Kaffe remembered in an interview that he always felt like the whole world was coming to us. In the 1960s, he moved to London to pursue a career as an artist. And at that point, knitting wasn't even part of the plan. In fact, he didn't even know how to knit back then. But sometimes the smallest moments can change everything. Part 2. The train journey. One day, Kaffe was traveling to Scotland with fashion designer Bill Gibb. They visited a wool mill that produced beautiful Shetland yarn, and Kaffe completely fell in love with all of the wonderful different colorways. He bought 20 different shades, and when he was on his way back to London in the train, there was a woman sitting across from him, and he asked her if she knew how to knit. She said yes, and then she taught him. And just think about that. One coincidental meeting, one moment, and in this one train ride, two strangers meeting, and that changed everything. Most people would have knitted a scarf or maybe a hat as their first knitting project, but Kaffe Fassett had a different idea. He wanted to knit a cardigan, and shortly after, somehow, his very first design ended up being published in Vogue Knitting. Part 3. The sweater that started everything. Just imagine the confidence that must have given a young artist who had just learned how to knit. He probably would have thought, maybe I'm onto something. It should have opened every door for him. But it didn't, because at that time, things were different. Color wasn't the norm, and designers weren't encouraged to stand out. Part 4. The English don't want to look distinctive. In one interview, Kaffe tells a story that perfectly captures the knitting world of the 1970s. He was at a cashmere yarn company, and he was hoping to be able to design a couple pieces for them, and he had brought one of his colorful designs. And when he showed it to them, they completely turned him away. And they said, the English don't want to look distinctive. They didn't tell him, your designs are not good enough, or we don't want to work with you. They basically told him, people don't want to stand out. And what is so remarkable about that is that Kaffe was not, promoting to wear more colorful designs. He was actually challenging the fact that handmade clothing was supposed to be something that you create if you want to blend in. And what's remarkable is that he never argued with them. He didn't try to convince them. He simply kept making the work he believed in. And eventually someone did say yes. And that yes would change Kaffe Fassett's entire career. And it would also change one of the most influential yarn companies in the world. Part 5. The partnership that changed everything. Every creative person needs someone who believes in them. And for Kaffe Fassett, that person was Stephen Sheard. Now we are in the late 1970s now, and Stephen Sheard recently co-founded Rowan, a relatively small company at that time, and like Kaffe Fassett, he believed that knitting could be more than following patterns. It could be beautiful, artistic, and joyful. A couple years later, Stephen remembered that he heard Kaffe giving a lecture, and what struck him so deeply was the sheer joy that Kaffe brought to design. And that gave himself the courage to believe that Rowan could become something different. A little while later, the two finally met in person. Stephen was at a yarn trade fair selling, and Kaffe came up to his booth and picked up a white Chanel yarn and said, "Do you have it in other colors?" And Stephen's answer would change both of their lives, because he said, "Would you like to design some colors for me?" And Kaffe could not believe it, so he later recalled asking, "If I do, will you actually listen to me?" And Stephen said yes. I absolutely love this story because sometimes we believe that a breakthrough comes through extraordinary talent, and in this circumstance, it came because someone listened. And for the first time, Kaffe wasn't asked to fit into someone else's vision. He was encouraged to bring his own. Together they began creating something that feels completely normal for us today, but was very unusual at that time. Instead of thinking about individual colors, they thought about color families. They began creating color palettes. And at one point, Rowan offered almost 100 different shades of color in one single yarn base. And that was almost unheard of at that time. And both of them give a lot of credit to a small independent dye house that made this possible. Listening to Kaffe talk about color, I noticed something interesting because he does not talk about colors individually. Instead, he talks about relationships, harmony, contrast, balance, and of course it makes perfect sense because before he became a knitter, he was a painter. And I think that is what makes Kaffe so different, because he did not approach knitting like a knitter, he approached it like an artist. Color wasn't just a decoration, it was his medium. And once people realized the possibilities, there was no going back. Part 6. Kaffe Fassett, the knitwear designer. But I think the easiest way to understand Kaffe Fassett isn't simply listening to interviews. It is by looking at his knitting patterns, because every one of them tells us more about the way he sees color. It all started here. This striped cardigan was the very first garment Kaffe knitted after learning on that train journey home from Scotland. And looking at it today, what strikes me isn't that it's loud. It's actually surprisingly restrained. The colors are earthy and harmonious, and already you can see the eye of a painter. He's not trying to show off. He's simply exploring how colors change one another when they're placed side by side. And just a few years later, his work changed dramatically. Persian poppies is probably one of his most recognizable designs, and I think it perfectly illustrates something that many people misunderstand about Kaffe's work. At first glance, it almost feels chaotic. There are dozens of colors competing for your attention, but the longer you look, the calmer it becomes. Every color is balanced by one another, and nothing feels accidental. There is no randomness, it is a composition. Something I noticed about Kaffe's work is that he wasn't afraid of scale. Most people use relatively small motifs, and Kaffe often did the opposite. Giant flowers, oversized geometric shapes, bold compositions that almost feel more like paintings than garments. Again, that's the influence of someone who first learned to think like a painter. And then there is tumbling blocks. And I love the fact that this design comes right after the more floral pieces that we just had a look at, because it completely changes our understanding of Kaffe's work. Up until now, you might be thinking he's simply inspired by flowers and nature, but this proves something different. This sweater isn't about flowers at all. It is about geometry. Every cube is created using nothing more than carefully chosen colors. There aren't any shadows, no three-dimensional shaping, just color. Yet somehow the surface suddenly appears to have depth. The blocks seem to rise and fall as your eyes move across the garment. And that is something that painters have understood for centuries. Colors don't just describe objects, they create the illusion of form itself. And I think that is exactly what Kaffe Fassett brought into knitting. He didn't choose colors to decorate sweaters, he composed them. Looking at these 4 garments together, I realized something, because they are completely different from one another. You have stripes, flowers, large-scale florals, geometry, and yet every single one feels unmistakably like Kaffe Fassett. Part 7. Kaffe's Real Revolution. By the early 1980s, Kaffe Fassett had become known for something that felt completely different. His designs were certainly colorful, but what truly set him apart weren't the colors themselves. It was the way he encouraged people to use color. In one conversation with Stephen Sheard, Kaffe Fassett said something that struck me, because he said even after decades of teaching, he still comes across regularly so many people who are afraid of colors, afraid of choosing them, afraid of playing with them, afraid of making mistakes. And he finds this incredibly sad, because from his point of view, colors aren't something to be afraid of, they are something to be enjoyed. And I think that is a feeling many of us can relate to, not just in knitting, but in creativity in general. We spend so much time worrying about whether we get it right that we sometimes forget to enjoy the process of making something. One thing I admire most about Kaffe Fassett's work is that he never presented color as a formula. He didn't say, these colors go together. Instead, he encouraged people to see for themselves, to compare, and to trust what they think. Stephen Sheard once described Kaffe as someone who radiated joy when speaking about color. And I think that is particularly why people are so drawn to him. Not because he taught about the rules, but because he is unafraid of breaking them. And that is definitely something I did not fully appreciate before this video, because Kaffe's contribution wasn't technical. He didn't invent a stitch or a famous sweater construction or taught something very unusual. His contribution was more philosophical. He taught people to trust themselves. And that's probably why his influence spread far beyond knitting, because once you understand his way of thinking, it does not stop at knitting. Part 8. More than a knitwear designer. Today, many people know Kaffe Fassett as a knitwear designer, but that is only part of the story, because he brought his same artistic vision to quilting, needlepoint, fabrics, interiors, ceramics, mosaics. The medium changed, but the message remained the same. Color has the power to transform ordinary things into extraordinary ones. That philosophy resonated far beyond the knitting community. Museums began exhibiting his work. His books were translated around the world, and generations of makers discovered that creativity didn't have to fit neatly into one category. Whether you hold knitting needles, a paintbrush, or a sewing needle, the invitation is the same: make something beautiful. Part 9. A life devoted to creativity. As I was researching about Kaffe Fassett, I was expecting to learn more about knitting, and what surprised me so much is that I also learned a lot about creativity, because even after more than 60 years of creating, Kaffe Fassett is still so curious about color combinations, about fabrics, about designs, and about asking the simple question, what would happen if? One thing I find particularly inspiring about Kaffe is that he does not separate art from his everyday life. His home, his studio, his books, his expeditions they all have, the same message, that creativity is not something he switches on for work. It is simply the way that he moves through life. And I think that is a beautiful reminder, because nowadays, when there are almost always long to-do lists and you feel exhausted after a long day of work, it can be so easy to think creativity is the last thing that I do when I have time for it. And if I don't, I simply don't do it. And Kaffe Fassett seems to suggest the opposite, that creativity is not what comes after your life, after everything is done, but that it is part of living well. Something that also really struck me when I was listening to the interviews that he gave, which by the way I'm all going to link in the description box if you want to check them out, is that he rarely talked about himself. Instead, he likes to talk about other people who were a source of inspiration or a support to him. The dyers, the knitters, the connections that he made, Rowan, his partner Brandon. He really shows us that creating this type of artistic work is not done isolated or alone. And I think that is one of the reasons why he became so influential. He didn't just build a movement around him, he invited other people into it. So I don't think the story about Kaffe Fassett is the story of color. It is actually something much bigger. It's trust your eyes, stay curious, don't be afraid to stand out, and never let someone else tell you what's beautiful. 50 years ago, someone told a young artist that people don't want to look distinctive. And thankfully, he didn't listen. And that's why today his work can be found in knitting patterns, yarn shops, museums, quilting shops, and in the work of countless makers all around the world who may not even realize where their confidence actually comes from. Kaffe Fassett didn't change the knitting world by inventing a stitch. Instead, he taught us that creating something beautiful starts with the courage to trust your own imagination. And I think that is something that is just as relevant now as it was 50 years ago. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you're also going to like the deep dive into the work and life of Stephen West. I'm going to link it for you here. And I hope you have a great day. Take care and see you soon. Bye.